Good, good morning. We actually had a note yesterday from someone who said maybe make less loud, obnoxious noises. So,
Okay, I'll try.
yeah,
I mean, I just can't help it sometimes. I get so excited to be on the morning show.
I'm so excited,
I just can't hide it.
but I know,
I know.
I know,
I know.
I know.
I want you. Want you.
uh,
Oh,
Good
man.
morning, Righty. Happy Righty. Does anyone ever call you Righty? Here,
Uh,
Righty.
yeah, I guess so. Would I play baseball or
Yeah.
something? Yeah, but I actually golf left-handed.
Oh.
Interesting little factoid
I
for
didn't
your
even
audience.
connect the righty aspect with the like righty, like
Writing that
yeah.
happens a lot. Yeah, I get the writer, as in writers in the storm. I get this quite a bit as well.
Riders in the storm.
Dum, 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 dum. Yeah, there's a lot of these little tunes. Also, Knight Rider, I get that quite a bit.
Oh, okay.
Um, Usually, I had one guy that called me Pinsky for about 3 years, and he laughed uproariously every time he called me Pinsky.
Because you're built like a truck.
Yeah, yeah. Those of you on the video stream, you know that.
But why
Yeah.
did he call you Penske?
Oh, Ryder Trucks. He thought I
Oh.
was a moving truck, and he was. Oh man, he was
Man.
just so impressed with himself for calling me Pinsky for years.
I personally have never been so impressed with myself that I only laugh at my own jokes and keep making them repeatedly. I never do
no?
that.
No?
No, that's not something
Yeah.
I do.
Well, I think I do it most of the time, but hopefully I'm making slightly different bad jokes every time. That's my goal.
That's actually that's also a good name for like a comedy album, like
Slightly different bad jokes.
slightly different bad jokes, volume 1. Yeah, it reminds me of at least one musician artist that did something like that where it was like, oh, I remember what it was. There was this I want to say my mom found it, is this YouTube playlist where it was songs about food. And it was like just a guy, in his office at home, just messing around or whatever. And there were some really great songs in there. It was like, butter. Yeah, we like butter. And put it on my toast. It's like something really silly like that.
Yeah, something that he's just goofing around and comes up with. Yeah.
Yeah, but he had like 3 albums of it, and it's on Spotify. And I actually was it was pretty good. Some of them were good, and they had some good I don't know, little funny tidbits in there and stuff like that. And it was like the kind is like, this is great,
Yeah,
and it's I also use it as inspiration because it's like whenever you're worried about something you're creating, one of the things you got to think about is anyone gonna like this? But this guy uploaded this thing like, I don't know, 10 years ago. I'm like, dude, this guy created something 10 years ago that's bringing a smile to people's faces 10 years later because it's just this goofy thing.
Yeah, that's it is this kind of weird thing. Like our buddy Danny, he and I follow a couple of musicians on Instagram that these guys just, I know they care, but they don't care. And there's something just so relieving about it. Like they just make, like Mark Ribier is one of these guys that just will make some insane tunes and spit them out, and he does most of it freestyle. And
So impressive.
yeah, it's sort of like, yeah, at some point, who cares? Have fun. And yeah, I'm kind of a big fan of it. I was also a Weird Al Yankovic fan when I was a kid, so
You stopped though? No longer a fan?
I haven't heard about anything about him in
He
years.
I don't think he's produced the same clip that he did in the past, but he's still doing stuff. Every now and then I'll hear something pick up, but yeah, I like him a lot.
Yeah. So I guess I'd have to say I'm a fan. I just haven't thought about him in a long time.
Yeah. Well, now that I'm thinking about it, like how many parody musicians have ever grown to mainstream success? I mean, like I feel like he's the only one I really know of that.
Yeah.
At least he's like the largest by far, right?
Yeah, I mean, you do have some sort of comedic musicians. You'll have like Flight of the Conchords or Tenacious D,
Okay.
and those would be in parody in terms, like
Sure.
for song. But yeah, he made like an entire career off of doing it to a level that the rest of them just never got to.
Yeah. Well. Also, I mean, I guess one difference between Tenacious D is unless I'm not aware, Tenacious D is original music.
Yeah.
Whereas Weird Al just straight up changes a song, right? You go
Yeah,
from
that's
for
a
those
good
who aren't
point.
aware,
Yeah.
like Weird Al Yankovic, you could look him up.
Yeah.
He's pretty
He's
good. And
got this epic movie he was in back in the day called UHF.
no, I've
If
not
you
heard of
have
that.
not seen this, oh man, you were in for a very pleasant B-level surprise.
Hey, that's what I like to hear.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
that's
yeah. I keep recommending like these B-level movies to read, things like Idiocracy, which I really love the movie, but you can't tell somebody this is a great movie because they go in thinking like, I don't know, Ben-Hur or something.
Yeah.
They think Chinatown. They think like when you say great movie, people come up with these like epic ideas in their mind. It's all of a sudden they're like, oh, is it like Avatar quality CGI? And I'm like, no, it's not.
it's like a dude with a stick and another and they're like bouncing around. Yeah,
right.
But yeah, and then they're like, oh, for those who are like, oh, great movies. And I'm like, I don't know anything about Chinatown. I don't know anything about Ben-Hur. So it's
okay,
like,
okay. Yeah. Well, oh man,
Man,
sometimes it's tough being the only one on the show
with
any-
pop culture references
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and
with
knowing
any
good
real
movies
class.
and yeah, exactly. Oh my, oh man, oh, can you believe? So yeah, I'd like to talk about expectations. I think that's a good discussion to have. So that's what we'll talk
it
about here in
is.
a little bit. But let's talk about yesterday. So yesterday, well, actually, hold on. Let's give the Writer Morning close up.
Hi
There he is.
everybody.
Hi.
I put on a beanie today, so it squashes the hair down.
Wow.
It's
This is
my
my
new,
beanie voice.
Yeah, hi.
Oh,
Wait,
well,
sorry, no more loud squeaky sounds in the morning.
welcome to the morning show. I'm Reed Garcia,
This is Ryder Richards.
and it is Friday, November 5th, 2021. It is,
Wow.
can you believe it's 21 years past the year 2000?
I actually have not really thought about it.
Man, Y2K, it was a thing, you know?
That was a thing. I remember actually being concerned about that thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you imagine now, like, people would not just worried about my dial-up computer no longer can access instant messages. Instead, it's your phone doesn't work. Can you imagine how much the world would burn if Y2K happened today?
Eh.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean it is kind of funny to think about how we weren't all that reliant on digital technologies back then, but everyone, I mean, we were, but we weren't.
Not to the extent
Not to the
by
not
today,
by
right?
comparison, right? And so today, if something just like if the Wi-Fi goes down in an area, people lose their minds. Like
Or
you know?
not even just goes down, but gets slower.
Yeah, right.
You're like, ugh, I'm drinking my $5 latte and my Wi-Fi does not load my YouTube video at 1080p on my phone, which is actually bigger than I need it to be because I can't even tell
Yeah,
a
can't
difference
even
on that
buffer
small
it.
of a
Yeah.
screen. Come on.
Yeah, and then of course you can't get your $5 latte because Starbucks runs on a Wi-Fi internet system or something now. So they don't even have cash registers. That was one of the things when we had the freeze up here last year. And then you couldn't purchase anything because the internet was down everywhere.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of a time I was waiting in line at the grocery store, and then the power went out, and they're like, the lines were already kind of long, and then the power went out, and I was just going to get like one thing, like on the way over to my parents' house, and it's like, it's gonna be 20 minutes for everything to reboot. I'm like, what? It's 2021. You got someone in the back like spinning up
know.
the systems.
20
Like,
minutes, yeah.
what are you doing?
Yeah. No, and not only that, but how could you not have sort of redundancy built into this? I would assume, but all that was also funny. I just canceled my Spectrum Business Internet yesterday.
That's also a good comedy album name.
By the way, everybody.
Coming out Friday. I just canceled my Spectrum internet yesterday.
Yeah. I know you just need a little more reality into your reality.
Yeah. So what do you got the aliens beaming the internet down to you or
well,
what?
No, I mean, just since the shop, I'm moving into the office at home, then I canceled the business line, which was our downtown
the one
office.
up here. Okay.
And what ended up happening was the plea to get me to keep business was that I get priority in case something goes wrong.
Oh, I mean, that makes sense. Oh, you don't want our service at all anymore? But what if we give you priority customer service?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it was like, if everyone else has an internet outage, you'll be last on the list to get the internet outage.
And you're like, ma'am, I'm looking for a permanent internet outage.
Yeah,
That's what I'm looking for.
that was actually what I wanted. Yeah. Anyway, I just found it funny that was the expectation for me on something like that is that we would all have equal access to internet because we're all paying basically the same amount. But the idea that your account being labeled as a business account all of a sudden has a different kind of priority access to it, I'm just like, oh, come on.
Yeah.
Like, I understand it, but at the same time, I find it to be a little bit frustrating.
Well, that's interesting, and let's put a pin in that one because I actually want to talk about customer support, and I really need to find out who these experts are because I want to bring somebody on because I have all these thoughts and ideas, and of course, I'm sure we both have plenty of complaints, but there's so many times where I'm like, it's in your best interest to provide better support. Why are you not doing it? And so we'll have that as the teaser for a future segment because we could get way down the line on that one. 1 second. Thanks. Okay. So what we were talking about was yesterday, but we're so good at staying on topic. Sometimes we just need to restart and actually play the intro, which we almost always forget to do. Helpful for life.
Want to continue?
Here we go.
Oh, hey,
yes.
it's us. We're back.
Yeah. We don't need time to talk about what we're going to talk about. What are you talking about?
No, I don't know.
No, who
Nothing.
knows nothing.
Whatever Reed says.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
what
Intro roll again. No, so yesterday. Let's talk about yesterday.
Recap.
The recap from yesterday. That's where we were. We never get distracted or run down rabbit holes or anything. So if you're watching this for the first time, this type of thing never happens.
We had our first segment yesterday of Gar.
Gar. We did have the first segment yesterday.
Yeah.
And for those who don't remember or are just curious what Gar is, you'll have to watch to find out. You'll have to watch to find out. That was episode 28 yesterday.
So,
November 4th.
and we talked about things like earbuds and noise canceling versus noise isolation.
Yes. We
jumped into a lot of little topics.
We're helping out a guy who was just getting tinnitus from riding his lawnmower and pumping his music too loud. So we gave a bunch of actionable tips as to how he can avoid that in the future, and even some specific recommendations as to which brands and things like that he might want to try out.
Yeah, and then after that, we jumped into a little bit of a different conversation, but it was about, of course, all of this is about being a professional consumer. Like, so what is your consumer journey like? Whenever you're doing something like, I don't know, research, for instance, like how deep do you go before you've gone too deep, right? Before you've wasted more time than the product is even worth. Like, how do you end up stopping this or making different decisions based off of it? So that was another thing that we started jumping into. We also started talking about sort of tips and tricks around purchasing. And since we do live in a consumer society, there's also smarter ways to use things like credit cards.
Yes, we did. So I might have been the first time or second time that we've talked about it, but for those who aren't aware, Helpful for Life has a credit card guide. So everything credit. So from the very beginning as to what is credit, when you should get it, regardless of how old you are, which you can even start getting credit before you're 18. So if you have kids, there's stuff in the guide that helps you with that. And if you got a huge amount of debt, if you got no debt, if you're trying to maximize your credit card rewards, all of those things are covered. It's called Swipe Right, the guide, the credit card guide, and you can find it at helpfulforlife.com/resources. For those of you like, why the heck is it called Swipe Right? Well, there used to be these things called credit cards that were these plastic squares, rectangles, and you actually physically swiped them. So instead of having to insert the chip or tap with your phone, so it made sense when I made the guide. Swipe right.
Yeah. See, because I was instantly thinking it was a Tinder reference.
Yeah, it was also a Tinder reference. It's like it's so you get the correct things, So it's kind of a double entendre, if you will.
Nicely done.
And that's also like swipe right, like swipe correctly, do credit the correct way. So many layers. It's like just like an ogre. I mean,
or a parfait.
A garlic parfait.
A garlic parfait.
Was that off air? Or was that on there?
No, that was
okay.
Shrek references.
Yes.
I think Eddie Murphy's voice. He was like, "How about a parfait, not an onion?"
Oh, I actually forgot that part of the actual movie. I thought that was just you making some bad
yesterday
joke.
I was making a joke.
It's much
about
funnier now that I know that Eddie
layers,
Murphy said it.
What do you mean? I don't have the same delivery as
Oh,
Eddie
I guess
Murphy?
not. I mean, but
Oh,
make sure to check out Ryder's new album coming out next Tuesday.
yeah,
I just got off of my Spectrum internet.
yeah. Spectrum business internet. Yeah.
Business internet. So that was yesterday. And our challenge from yesterday was something around that purchasing journey.
Yes. Challenge was to actually change up your purchasing journey in some way, and our suggestion there was to, instead of researching for hours and hours and hours, just buy 2 items or 3 items, take a look at them, get them in your hands, see what you actually think about them, and then send back the ones you don't use. And I sort of admitted to having some trepidation about this because I felt like that was abusive towards some sort of system or whatever else. And uh, yet that also just makes me think about how conditioned I am
Yeah.
as a person. Like, these companies exist for us, they invent these policies for us, and then to turn around and sort of ask us not to use the policies. ah, I don't know. Like, I don't know if I should feel bad about that.
Yeah. The only thing I'll say is, especially as a business owner, I do see the cost of, handling returns. And so the main thing I'll say is, as you're opening things, especially if you think there's a good chance you're going to return it, be respectful. Like, don't completely rip open the packaging and throw everything all around. Like, just use a little scissors and stuff and make clean cuts so that way they can package it up and sell it again, right? Because if you destroy the packaging and tear into it, like, which technically legally you're like allowed to do, like, but now that company has to send that all the way back to the manufacturer, and they're gonna lose more money on that. So that's the only silver lining I'll give.
Yeah, the negative side is with like things like car parts. Then last time I had to return something, then they had a $45 restocking fee, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh, right. And so it's very much like, yes, make sure you purchase the right thing. And the guy on the phone with me was very short about it. He was not happy. So anyway, but that's for another day. We could jump into the customer service.
Well, it
journey.
is. Yeah, the customer service aspect, but it's kind of related to what we're going to talk about. So let's talk about the things we're going to talk about today, right? So we've got the first thing we want to talk about is expectations, and they could be great, they could be minor. We'll find out. And then later today, we're actually going to have a little bit more of a interactive, not I guess visual type of thing. So for those of you who are on audio only, we'll explain some things, but this might be one that'll be worth going back on YouTube to watch, and that is how to hang a curtain rod.
Oh yeah, we're gonna do that today.
Yeah, so the trick is, for those of you at home, you're like, oh, how do you hang a curtain rod? It's like, all right, first you start a podcast show, and then you invite a host who's DIY kind of guy, and then you leave the curtain rod hung for at least 3 weeks, and eventually he's like, I'll put the dang thing up for you.
This is driving me crazy.
So that's what we got coming on later.
Minutes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's what we're good at. And so, yeah, so that's the two things that we'll probably be dealing with today. So let's get started with expectations. So when I say the word expectations, what comes to mind? What do you expect?
Man, I think of the movie Great Expectations.
What is the theme of that, or what's the storyline? I don't even know.
I think it's based off of an old novel, but the story that I watched as a kid had Ethan Hawke, and I think it isn't Uma Thurman. It's one of these other lovely tall actresses. It's all willowy and stuff, but yeah, I remember in that. In the movie anyway, then there's something around this kind of idea of yearning and different class levels colliding and how romance works within this kind of system.
Class levels, romance, expectations.
Yeah, of course.
I expect it to be
the
slightly
boy loves
boring.
The girl, and yet they can't quite get it to work. But in the movie, the guy is an artist. Ethan Hawke is an artist,
that's why you liked it so much. You saw yourself in Ethan Hawke.
Yeah, and just feeling all this pain, and then but he bumps into like a mafia boss who's played by Robert De Niro. Robert De Niro's character ends up buying out his first New York show, so he sets the kid for life.
Like, he puts him as the actor in the show, or
well, because as an artist, if you have a sold out show in New York, then they know that you're a valuable commodity.
Oh, okay.
And so by doing this for the young up and coming artist, by renting him a studio loft, getting him into the New York scene, getting him his first gallery show, buying out the entire show, then he has backing behind him, and because people are sheep and they follow other people, then all of a sudden he becomes sort of rich and famous, and he moves around becoming a fancy artist. But of course he never actually got the girl, and the girl treated him horribly when he was young, would like all this kind of stuff. So anyway, when I think about expectations, he had this expectation of the way the world would go, and it went completely different.
And he got success in one way, but maybe not in another. Is
Right,
that kind of
not
one of the
until the
themes?
very end. Of course, the story wraps up in a Hollywood
Right.
ending where they,
They all get together, and
yes.
then they're crying outside in the rain, and they say, "Did you get my letters?"
Oh, right.
That's that movie, right?
What? What letters? Yeah.
I wrote you every day. Get off the door, Jack. You're gonna die. Oh wait, different movie too.
Different.
Oh,
Yeah,
dang it.
so many movie references. But
I
no,
gotta,
it was,
I gotta give some sort of pop culture references.
yes,
I
there
gotta
we
throw in the
go.
three
Yeah.
movies I've seen.
The Notebook is one of them.
Yeah.
Oh, movies.
Look, when you're dealing with movie references with me, 60% of the time it works every time. That's 3 days in a row for those of you who are wondering. 3 days in a row I've made some
Anchorman.
Anchorman reference. We're gonna see how long this trend can go.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to rewatch the movie so I can pick up more.
So I it just went off on a long tangent about great expectations, but the point is, like, having a goal is actually what leads to heartbreak in an
Okay.
interesting way, and which is sad because it's also the thing that pulls you out of the muck.
Yeah, no,
But sometimes like fate can just intervene.
that's a really interesting thing, and it's a big thing for me too, right? I mean, I'm in the middle of creating this company, right? And it's like, oh, what do I think it's going to be? What do I expect it's going to be? And even just things like this, like the show, or even an individual episode, or even a segment about expectations. I'm thinking about how this is going to go, and then you invite a writer to the party, and you're like, well, the chance of uncertainty
Wah,
goes
wah,
way
wah.
up.
Where
But
did you want this to go?
Yeah,
I will
exactly.
go the opposite direction. Thank you very much.
But that's the thing, though, is about setting an expectation is, in general, it's best to have, in my opinion, either low expectations or no expectations. I think the more specific and the higher the expectations, the more you set yourself up for a letdown, essentially, right?
Maybe so, but also I would assume that you need to have. It's difficult when we get into expectations and goals. So, for instance, if you have expectations, um, if you have expectations that are high, or you could also consider those to be goals. And you can set goals for yourself and work to achieve those. And of course, you can be let down if you don't achieve them. But how else do you get better unless you set things in front of you and you pursue them? So I think there's a slight difference there in like expectations for things like going to a movie versus like how you get your business off the ground.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess I would kind of classify it as two types of expectations. And one of them is something that you have control over, and the other one is something that you don't have control over, right? But yet, it's interesting because in both cases, you have some sense of control because at the end of the day, you're controlling your thoughts and your reactions. And I was going to say your feelings, but obviously you can only control those so much. But how do you control those? But by setting your expectations. So
No, right, and there's a breakdown there as well of measuring outcomes. There's a difference between measuring performance and measuring outcomes, having systems and what your numbers, your metrics are on the backside, and sometimes getting those conflated, actually thinking that you are the value of your metrics when you aren't, right? But your system is a big part of how that plays out. But one of the funny things as well about expectations is that being that they can also be psychological in nature, just like Alexandra talked about, we do need to kind of like pause sometimes and reconsider what those are. Have you ever had your expectations flipped on you where you thought something was going to be horrible, a horrible experience, and it turned out to be pretty good?
yeah, I mean, this entire show with you, it's like, man, you just like set them down here, like, oh, this is gonna be a dumpster fire, but and then it's like, oh, it's actually not too bad.
Okay, that works.
Okay. No, in a more serious way, let me think. There have been times where I've expected something to be horrible, and then it's been better. I don't know. Nothing immediately jumps to mind, but I would say a couple of spots might be food. There's certain times where I look at a dish or a type of something. And so the other day, fortunately for me, there's only two and a half types of food that I don't really like. And I'd like to explore them both more. But they're olives and mushrooms. And olives, I mean, the main ones that I've had have been like black olives and Kalamata and probably maybe green ones. But I don't really like those that much. And then with the I know there's all sorts of other types of olives, and I'm sure if I had one fresh off a tree from Italy or whatever, like
It
it
would
would be
be
a different,
horrible.
right? It would be a
Yeah.
different experience. But
No, I see. I love olives, so I love
olive
them.
juice, olive juice.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, I'm blushing.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. But no, I'm really a big fan of olives and mushrooms. So I find all this to be like, I mean, not the psychedelic mushroom as much, but just like the kind that you would get at a restaurant. And
I'm
anyway,
glad you thought about that.
yeah, I did. Of course I did, because I'm still halfway through the Michael Pollan book that's about how to change your mind, which is mostly about shroom tripping and mushrooms in general and how they play a role in our ecosystem. So yeah, I'm kind of interested in all that, but I'm not a big fan of onions.
Oh,
So
oh,
see, and
ooh.
people who love onions are like,
Yeah,
"What,
what is
dude?"
wrong with you? Yeah.
Yes.
No, so onions are actually okay. So the other two foods were seafood and onions. So onion was the first food that I kind of started to rediscover, and I'm pretty sure what happened early on when I was younger was I had some raw white onions, maybe on a McDonald's hamburger or something like that, and I was like, "Oh, this is a really sharp bite. Like it's kind of funky and pungent." And I was like, "No, I don't like onions." So then I wrote off all of onions, right?
Yeah.
So classic case of trying one type of thing and then writing off the entire thing, like right, the entire genre.
Yeah.
It's kind of like listening to a musician. You like I hear one song, you're like, I don't like that, and I'm like, oh well, that's just one of their songs. Or it's like, oh, I heard that people get kidnapped in Mexico. I'm never going to all of Mexico, the entire country,
Right,
because some people get kidnapped. You could take this to many examples, right? But then later on, I tried caramelized onions. And then
Oh,
once I had caramelized onions, it's like, okay, I need to reevaluate what onions are, because for those who aren't familiar with caramelized onions, they're completely different from a raw onion. They get really sweet and they get darkened because of two things called caramelization and the Maillard reaction. And you're like, Reed, those are really fancy words. What do those mean? Well, I'm glad you asked, because those are things that we teach you about in Kickstart Your Kitchen. So we have an online course for those of you who haven't heard, kickstartyourkitchen.com, where you can revolutionize your cooking game in as little as a weekend. And if you're like, oh, Reed, I know how to cook. I've been cooking for years. Guess what? There's a lot of things that you learned that are probably wrong. And I can almost guarantee that to you. But even if I can't guarantee that to you, I can guarantee you all of your money back. So if you take the class and you don't like it or you don't get anything out of it, then just request your money back. 100% money back guarantee. But
and
anyways,
be nice to that packaging when you return it too.
yes, be nice
yeah.
to that packaging. I am the packaging. But yeah, so once I started caramelized onions, then it was like, okay, these are pretty good. And then I started having them in other things. Like, oh, you know what? Like a red onion and a pico de gallo, like that's pretty good. And then I started to explore more and more. And then now I like raw onions too, because I've kind of exposed myself to it, and I started to like them a little more. And then I appreciated them more for what they were. And I'm not gonna bite into a raw onion like an apple, but I recognize that sharp, pungent bite is a good balancing element to some other foods, like a rich, meaty burger with some fatty cheese and things like that. So onions, and then mushrooms. So mushrooms and olives. So mushrooms I started to eat again, and I'm like, all right, I'll like them. I tried them. So my expectation the other day was when somebody had dried mushrooms out, I was like, I don't think they're going to be very good. I think probably not going to like it. But I tried it. And I tried it, and I was like, oh, this is actually really good. And I actually went back and got some more. So that is the time when my expectation
Okay.
was flipped. And
See,
the
I'm
key of
thinking
the long
things
stories
like
here.
family vacations. I'm thinking of like, oh man, this Christmas is going to be horrible because all these competing interests are now at play. And like, I just start getting all anxious about it. And I'm just like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. You got to do this. Man up. Do the right thing. And I go, and sometimes they're just fine.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one, and I think that actually highlights one of my hypotheses about expectations, which is the more likely you are to get stressed or anxious or on edge or something like that, I bet you probably have more expectations in your life. And fortunately for me, I'm very low on that spectrum, and so I'm also a pretty optimistic guy. So I don't think I really set really bad expectations for anything. And I also try to not build things up, because I've definitely done the thing with like a movie or a book or something, and it's overhyped, and then you watch it and then you're kind of like disappointed. It's like, it's better to just not.
Yeah. Well, and I think what we're seeing here is that Reed just doesn't think about anything. That's how you get away with having these no expectations.
Exactly, exactly. But fortunately for me, guys, I brought on a co-host who has a podcast called "Let Us Think About It."
Yeah, it's a horrible habit to get into. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't start thinking.
Oh, thinking it hurts. Oh.
Well, it just leads you to heartbreak and disappointment.
So last night I played this game for the first time. It was called our
Gartic.
Gartic. Yes, it's called Gartic, and it's this game where it has various modes, but essentially involves drawing and people guessing what you're trying to draw. And there's a little bit of a telephone aspect to it sometimes, and sometimes it's you're trying to mimic whatever the other person drew. And we actually played with Danny, our friend.
Good, good,
He's has some artistic inclinations, and
Yeah.
it's fun to see his drawings compared to my more caveman type. Or Danielle was playing on her phone, and so she's just using her finger on the small screen, and like meanwhile I'm on my pencil. And I'm like, Apple Pencil, look at my great art. But it was fun because my expectations were like, I know I'm not gonna have the most pretty pictures, but I'm gonna have a fun time drawing the thing, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we play a game like that with. I have a buddy we'll have him on the show one of these days, and he's a CEO of sort of a video game company, but they really sort of build the platforms that the video games run on. And so he's a creative guy, a creative director, and him and his wife are both artists. They draw all the time. We also have Richard and Lauren Long on. Richard Long is a fantastic comic book artist who does it professionally. And so you get sitting, and then my wife and I both have art degrees. So you get all six of us around a table playing a game like this where we're drawing these things, and the drawings get outrageous.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah. So it's a blast. Not only that, but the version of it we play, then you have to write down. One person has to turn into words what they think is on the drawing.
Right.
And so they have to describe it, and then it has to go back around. So that telephone aspect, it gets crazier and crazier.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's a similar game that you can buy on a box. It's called Telestrations, or the more fun version, Telestrations After Dark, which is the adult version. But yeah, I've played that many times, and that's just with a expo marker, dry erase marker, and like a little pad of little mini dry erase pages, I guess. And so it's fun, but it's also interesting to see the different ways people play it and the different expectations that they have for what the game's supposed to be. And there's some people who like they take it like, very serious, and they're worried like their drawing's not good enough and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, look, in my mind, you're setting the wrong expectations here. The expectations for me are, let's make something silly happen. Let's laugh. Let's have a good time. And then when I'm looking at like the card for the options of the things that we're gonna do, or in the case of Gartic, you actually write your own in. I'm like, what is the most ridiculous thing I can do that is, there's no way it's going to make it all the way back around, because it's like, there's no way you can accurately portray that thing. And that's in my mind, the fun part of it is like, okay, I start out with this picture of a guy sitting on the toilet, and then it ends up turning into, a flying saucer, going through the air, right?
Well, it's funny with us because, the game we're playing, it starts with words. So it starts with language. So if the language is something like, a bushel of apples, well, then that's one thing. But when it's something like expectations, and you're like, how do you draw that?
Right.
It gets really bizarre given the language that's used.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. So any other thoughts on expectations before we shift over to the DIY project?
Of course, I've got some, because expectations is so interesting on on sort of a level that I would just want to say that I think it's a preparatory mechanism. I think that people have expectations about things so that they are not sort of frightened or scared, so that they can stabilize themselves before moving into some sort of situation in the future. And so there is kind of an adventurous aspect. Like Reed, for example, is very adventurous, so he'd be willing to show up at just about any event and just take it as it comes. A lot of people don't have that kind of adventurous spirit, so they're looking for some sort of stabilization, which is what gets them in these ruminative thinking loops that can also quite be destructive over time. So one of the things about expectations is to, just be aware that you're having them, and just go, oh, this is my expectation, reel that in, check that. Be open to the process rather than being open to what could potentially go wrong here or right here.
Right.
It's also like you're saying, like, it's, if you build them up too much, there's also something about like if you're a fanboy for a movie or you're a fanboy for the new iPhone and it comes out, you might also just experience confirmation bias where because your expectations were so high this thing could never fail, you have already decided it will never fail, so you're not objective about it.
Yeah. To allude to what Alexandra said the other day, the more comfortable she is and the more sure she is, the more she realizes, oh, maybe I should make sure to
Yeah.
check my bias on that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, a couple things popped in my head when you were saying that. And one is the frequency of the times that you've experienced the thing, right?
Mm.
Because I've realized that that's a thing that I've seen with some of my friends is like, oh, if I'm gonna go to, let's say for a concert, right? Some common things that some people think about in a concert is like, oh, there's gonna be all these people, it's gonna be this big crowd, and then I'm like, I don't know, like, should I dance? Should I not dance? Like, what if I sing along? And then they're like trying to like think about all these ways that the thing is gonna be, and then meanwhile, like the people who are kind of on the other end of the spectrum, like they're not paying attention. They're just like doing whatever
Yeah,
they think,
right,
where they
right.
feel. It's like they're not like in their own head about it, right? Which is that's one of those things. It's just like, all right. Another start part is one. The more you do it, the more samples you get, the better feel you can get for the thing, right? So
Mm.
it's like, all right, I've been to one concert, and now I'm going to write that off as that's what all concerts are like. It's like no, like there's so many different ways for that to be, or like, for example, like restaurants. That's another one where it's like restaurants are like I don't know, whatever unique snowflakes. There's a whole bunch of different kinds, right? You go to one and it's like, oh, this one is really loud and noisy and crowded, and then there's other ones where it's like there's like nobody in here and it's super calm and peaceful. So it's like having by sampling more of the various types of things, you can get a more accurate expectation of what the thing might be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the last thing on that one was just again like focusing on the fact that you get to control your expectation and your reality and how you perceive things, right? To use the analogy we've used a couple times, of if you think of yourself like a computer, you have all these inputs that you are coming at you, but at the end of the day, you're the one who processes them and decides what your output is, right?
Yeah, yeah, and it's not an easy process, but yeah, let's kind of focus on just being aware of those things as they filter in and as they start to filter back out.
Yeah. All right. So, any other last thoughts on
No, no, that's
expectations?
good. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, I don't know how that segment compared to y'all's expectations, but we shall see. You never know sometimes with these things. So we are going to take a quick pause as we set up the camera in the other room, and we would have some music for you, but been having some technical issues still. I need to write my angrily worded email, so I can get that dealt with. But we're going to go into the other room where. Ryder is going to work on my rod. So we'll be right back. All right. Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so for those of you who are just joining us, we are about to hang a curtain rod. And, you know, for those of you like, this is so basic. You're like, well, it isn't that complicated. But there are a couple of things that you need to keep in mind as you're doing it. And so that's why I've now hired this lovely, strapping young man to help us with this curtain. And we're going to get this rod, which is expandable, up there somehow. So that's what we'll be working on. And yeah, if you're on audio only, you might want to watch this on video later on YouTube. And then also we may end up going a few minutes over. So let's keep going. What do we got right here? What's the first step?
Okay, well, we've got these little brackets, and this is going to go up on the wall here. There's probably going to be 3 of them, and I'll walk up so you can maybe see them. But each one of these there'll be one on each corner and one in the center. What we're probably going to need to do is release this so that we can actually hang these inside here. So that's one of the first steps that I'm going to do just as kind of a prep work. The other thing that we need to do is realize how high the curtain is, how tall the curtain is. So what we have here is Reed has a set of curtains that are 95 inches tall. And we need to make sure that the curtain rod hangs at a height that allows those curtains to just barely touch the ground or stay just a half inch above the ground to keep them from being dirty, something like that. So those are some of the concerns that I sort of have immediately. What's nice about this bracket is, I don't know if you can see, but maybe if I block out the sun you can. Once it's released, I can turn it to actually, when I want to mount this to the wall, I can turn it sideways and the gun can actually poke through that hole. So that's kind of a handy little thing, because if it's this way, then your screwdriver gets in the way when you try to start going like that. So being able to rotate this to the side is quite handy. So that's a little just design feature. And the other thing we're going to try to do is get it level. One of the things that happens is the floor and the ceiling are almost never level. So while you can measure from the ceiling down, or you can measure from the floor up, they're almost never level. The other trick that I do, because of course you can have a tape measure, you can stand up on here and you can try to measure all the way across, but you see it's longer than my arm span. So one of the tricks that I do to find the center of a space like this is come in here, I have a little pencil here, and I'll make a tick mark at what I think is the center, so say 48 inches. Flip to the other side, mark here, and I have 48 inches and it's not quite center. So what I'm left with is 1.5 inches in between. So then I just do the math, that's 3/4 of an inch. And then I know that my center is actually at 47.25 inches. So by measuring to each side and then just doing a little bit of math, I end up establishing where the center is. So as we've said, we want the curtain to hang at roughly 95, maybe a little bit higher than 95. So I can put a tick mark here, and this is just a reference. It's not something that I'm going to use. It's just to sort of make sure that I'm in alignment. So what's better if you want something like that is to put your level up here. See if your bubble floats level, and it sure doesn't. So I need to actually go up about 1/4 inch on this side. Now I'll move to the other side and go up 1/4 inch on that side, and that will give me the height that will make sure that the curtain rod is actually level. So what I'm doing here is lining up my tick mark in the center with what's going on the sides here. And this one actually is in level with the center mark. So that's how I'm going to do this. What happens when they construct these places is that they actually build 2x4s around the edges so that you typically can hit a stud if you keep your brackets on the outside edges of the window. If you come inside above the window, you might hit the header.
Which is what?
The header is a support beam, a cross piece that goes across here. If the building is made out of metal, they have a different kind of header than if it's made out of wood. But you can still usually poke through a metal stud and still get a plug in there sometimes. But also, if it's a metal stud, you might just be able to screw straight into it and get the screw to catch, and then that'll be a nice strong connection.
Any idea how you can tell if it's metal or wood?
I do it simply by feel. Like after I drill in, I have a drill gun and I put a tiny bit on it and I go in the hole where I think it's going to be, and I can feel by the way the drill spins or catches or it doesn't catch. Usually with steel it doesn't catch and you have to push harder. It also tends to have metal studs have a slight flexibility to them. So you feel the drill hit and then you feel a small flex. And that's how I know that I'm drilling into a metal stud rather than a wooden stud. Wooden stud, it'll just come straight through and you can see the sawdust come out when you drill the hole.
Yeah, so for those who aren't aware about how walls work, at least here in America and probably most of the world maybe, but I'm not sure. But basically there are wooden studs like this. A stud is normally what you use for people like me or Ryder here. But it actually is a 2x4 piece of wood. So piece of wood, kind of like, honestly, like my arm. And they are spaced 16 inches across between here and here. That's a very common distance in America. I think some other places may use 24, but I'm not too sure. But anyways, they have these, basically this frame of wood that forms the wall. And then what goes on top of that?
Usually on the outside of the building, it's you'll do things like a layer of plywood and a vapor barrier, and then you might end up doing something like cladding with siding or brick. But on the inside, which is typically what we're working with, it's going to be something like sheetrock.
Yeah, so that's what forms, especially in apartments, the nice smooth white wall that you see. That is sheetrock, or is another term drywall?
Drywall.
Okay,
yes.
So those are the same thing or different?
Same thing as far as I know.
Okay.
I think it's a brand issue.
Gotcha. Kleenex type of thing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So with that drywall, so basically anytime you're hanging something, that's one of the concerns is how heavy is this thing that I'm hanging? And another concern is how much force will be pulled on this thing. So for example, if you're hanging a towel rod and you know that towel may get yanked, you're going to want it to be better anchored to the wall, better connected to the wall than if it's just, say, a photo that you hang up that's really light and is never going to be touched again, right?
Yeah. No, and these are, you can just put a picture, if it's a light picture, you can just put it on the wall with a thumbtack, for instance, and it'll be fine for a while. If you want to be more secure, you can go to Home Depot and you can look at all of the accoutrement that is for hanging pictures.
Yeah, so this is actually right here, a sorted picture hanging, and it's going to have...
So sorted.
Yeah, so sorted. And it's going to have things like this, which allow you to hang some beefier things. And there are some things that actually you want to have wire to help connect to a nail in the middle. And then, of course, there's the, who doesn't know they're picture hangers? There's the sawtooth type connector, which sits on the back of a frame or something like this, and then a nail. So there's various types of things on here, and when you buy something like this, on the back it'll tell you rough weights that it can support. And so when we're talking about where you hang on the wall, so we've got the studs, and then everywhere else there's drywall. So when you poke through that drywall, if there's no resistance on the back end, that means that no resistance on the back end is a good thing. You don't want to be too constipated. No resistance on the back end, that's just the drywall you're going through. But as you're screwing through, if you end up feeling more resistance and it's kind of hard to get in there, then it's going into a stud, most likely. And that stud, in most cases, in a residential home, is going to be made out of wood. But in commercial buildings like apartments and offices and things like that, sometimes is metal, especially if you're dealing with an exterior wall.
Yeah, and a lot of this is built around fire code as well. Fire code does not like wood in commercial buildings. So most commercial buildings have to be made out of metal studs. And also sheetrock or drywall is usually somewhat flame retardant or flame resistant. So that's another reason why you use it as a building material. So there's several benefits to it. Sheetrock or drywall is also sound deadening, sound absorptive. So that's another thing. What happens is between the studs, you have your 16 inches or 24 inches. 24 inches is called advanced framing, and 16 inches is traditional framing. but you can actually put insulation inside there. And so oftentimes when you go into something like drywall, you'll see something come back out. It'll be stringy, cottony kind of substance, and that is usually your insulation that's inside there. A lot of times, especially in apartments and places like that, and even in houses, they don't insulate interior walls, only the exterior walls.
And one thing to point out with insulation, especially if it's this cotton candy pink looking stuff, that actually, and I don't know if they're still using that as much as they used to.
They're still the pink color. It's
still
Corning Owings.
Okay, but yeah, it's some of you might recognize the brand Corning. It's actually a glass brand, and this is actually fiberglass, if I'm not mistaken, which is basically really small, thin threads of glass. So it actually can kind of sharpen, can kind of like give you like these micro cuts on your hands and stuff like that. So if you end up, as you're doing, especially if it's not that big a deal when you're drilling a small hole, but if you're doing anything significant where you've got a big hole in the wall and you've got a lot of fiberglass you're dealing with, just be careful and wear gloves.
And a respirator.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to be breathing in
little tiny shards of glass.
Tiny shards of glass.
Yeah. Tiny Shards of Glass is Ryder's second album coming out next Thursday.
Listening party. So anyway, we're going to do what I'm going to sort of work on here is I'm going to mark up in the corners where I want this to hang. Hopefully it will encounter a stud, because if it doesn't encounter a stud and you just try to put a screw into sheetrock, there's little threads on the screw, and as they go into the sheetrock, well, this is just basically a form of light plaster, and those threads will not hold, and it'll just want to rip out as soon as you put any weight on it. So they have plastic plugs, they have all sorts of different anchoring devices, and the idea behind them is as the screw goes through the wall, then on the back, that plug actually spreads, and it increases the surface area on the back side of the wall, so you disperse the tension of the hanging across a larger surface. So that's the idea on almost everything, is you want to spread out the surface area on which the weight is pulling down. So as gravity pulls downward, you want it leaning flush against the wall, and you want that surface area spread out. So that's what a plug does for you, is it'll spread that one little like 1/8 inch screw width, and it'll spread it out to something like 1.5 inches or 1 inch. And that means that you're not doing as much damage to the sheetrock. But if at all preferable, especially when you're hanging something like a television, you should be looking for studs in the wall. They have things called stud finders, and I've got one at home. I just don't have the 9-volt battery that it takes to run it. Apparently now there are weird apps you can even use on your cell phone to figure out where studs are. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just going to use old school techniques. Another thing you can do is use magnets, because the screws that go into wooden studs are magnetic. So you can use a magnet and run it over a wall, and when it sticks, that's where you know that there's a screw. And if there's a screw there, odds are that it's going through the sheetrock into a 2x4 or into a metal stud. So that's another alternate way to find studs in the wall.
Nice. Okay, so when we're talking about I just wanted to show off my lovely drawing skills here. So look, this is one demonstration of what an anchor might look like. So here you have a screw or something that you're putting into the wall, and well, if we have an anchor, there's some that this is actually closer to a toggle bolt, I believe, than what I drew here. But you have some things that spread out and open up on the other side.
Yeah.
And then there's some that just kind of, they start off being like this, but then when you put them in, they widen to a wider thing.
So these are two versions, and I don't know, they're going to be hard to see because they're kind of white, small, and clear. But this version actually has a split in it, and you can see where when the screw goes in, it actually splits down the middle, and that split turns into this toggle that Reed has shown here. This version just has deeper threads, so it eats into the sheetrock differently. So you can see the difference in the thickness on these two. One of them has much thicker threads on it.
And when we're talking about threads with the screw, that's the little spirally parts.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's there you go. All right, so when we're talking about hanging a curtain, so that's what we're doing here today. We are hanging a curtain rod. What are the steps that you need to do when you're hanging a curtain rod?
Yeah, sorry, I just sort of jumped into it. My first thought on something like a curtain rod is to find the center of the wall and find the height.
Okay, so you've got your curtain rod, and so in cooking we have a term called mise en place, which is basically a French way of saying everything in its place. You get all the things prepped that you need. So when you're hanging a curtain rod, you're going to need the rod itself, which is over there off the camera. You're going to need the hanging equipment, which Ryder showed you guys a few minutes ago. And in this case, and in most cases, you can look at the instructions that come with the thing. It'll tell you what tools you might need. And also if you need anything else, right? So in this case, I would say most people probably want to have a pencil.
Yeah, I think so this is pencil, tape measure,
And
right?
then maybe a drill or a screwdriver.
Screwdriver, and I like to use a level as well, as mentioned very early on. Then there's almost nothing level in a home or an apartment. And so you can't trust on just making a measurement from the floor or from the ceiling because they're going to vary between a quarter to a half inch and sometimes a full inch difference. And what's going to be weird about that is you're going to be like, but I measured and then I hung the curtain rod. Why does it look crooked? Part of that is because your ceiling probably isn't level. So there's going to be little issues there. But as far as the tools go, yeah, I usually carry around with me a drill gun, and I actually have a little compact kit that I keep in the truck with me at all times, just in case. But you can also just use a typical screwdriver, just one that you use by hand, and that won't help you with drilling holes, but it definitely can help whenever if you can find a stud, then you can just screw straight into it.
Right. So the time that you would maybe prefer to have a drill, maybe if you don't have one, you could borrow one from a friend. And actually, I think you can get them pretty inexpensively these days. If there's one tool to buy in the tool world, I think a drill is probably the first one. Is that what you would think too?
Yeah, I mean, there's basics like a tape measure. But,
power tool rather.
But as far as a power tool, that would be it. And honestly, this little screwdriver I'm holding probably costs as much as a power drill these days because the prices have dropped so dramatically. Not that this is expensive, but
The
that
power
they
tools
have
have
dropped
gone-
so much in cost.
And then the other tool that you might need if you're doing these drywall anchors, if you're doing the kind that's like this, basically the way you do the drywall anchor is you drill a hole into the wall and then you push this into that hole. And sometimes people will use a hammer to kind of push it in if it's a snug fit. So that's the only other tool, at least right now, I can think of that you might want or need. But the pencil you want to have to mark the wall so you can see where you're going to be hanging the thing. But yeah, without further ado, so now we've measured, and Ryder showed us a very helpful tip on if you have a wide gap to work on, how can you get the level, and if you don't have a level quite that large, basically how you can have a way to get something level without having to be able to span the whole thing. And as far as things being level, at the end of the day, just get it kind of close. Unless it's way off, like you could spend all the time in the world perfecting it. And guess what? You're gonna put these little marks. And guess what? When you make the hole, you're probably gonna end up being a little high or a little low of that hole. So it's not gonna be perfect. And be okay with that. Set your expectations that it's not gonna be perfect. To reference what we were talking about earlier. And guess what? You're not gonna notice that big of a deal. Now, this is especially true when you're dealing with things like pictures and things like that. But one thing to keep in mind, things will be more obviously off if they're not level when they're next to other long straight lines. So in the case of this, we do have one long straight line here up with the window just by the frame, this is called the header, as Ryder was telling us. And so that long straight line does have a somewhat point where you've got your level thing. So if one's way off, it's more obvious because they're right next to each other. And similarly, if you're hanging a bunch of photos on the wall, if you've got a collage of a whole bunch of them, if one of them's off, you're going to be able to tell a lot more than if you just have one thing on the wall.
Yeah, no, these are all excellent points. I used to hang pictures for a living, so that was one of the jobs that I had.
Did your credit card say I'm hung?
Can you believe it didn't?
I said credit card, but I meant business card.
Business card. No. I would have been great to have that on the credit card.
Yeah.
What's your PO?
Yeah.
No, I think that since I used to hang pictures and since I used to hang a lot of pictures and it would usually be like 8 in a row or they would be in a specific grid, then you can get very fussy at that point in time, which is also why instead of doing that, people just space things out randomly, and that's more salon style would be the term for it. But what we're doing here, it's not going to be that important. Not only that, the curtain will come down and will hide most of the hard edges. So it's even less important here than it would be anywhere else. However, we're just trying to show you maybe the right way you could go about doing it. It's not even the right way. It's just a step above just getting up there with a hammer and starting to hit stuff.
Yeah, and so the whole point of this segment in this video is when you are hanging a curtain, this is the thing you can use kind of as a, hey, here are some things to keep in mind. Here are the steps. Here's how a dude who's been doing DIY stuff for a long time now, here's some of the tricks of the trade he's picked up over the years. And so here's some things you can keep in mind. I know for me, when you're following the basic instructions on the paper, they leave so many things unsaid. So the goal with this instruction here is to help answer all those questions that you might have as you're just sitting there and running into issues. So off screen here, we have a friend who was trying to hang a curtain the other day. And what was the issue that you ran into?
I think I hit the metal flashing or the corner, and then I tried going above to get the edges lined up, but then the centerpiece, it needs a supporting center, and I couldn't find a stud there. So when we're done here, I'm taking you with me.
Yeah, this is something else that we did not mention, but these hard edges, whenever you see these, then there's different ways of handling an edge where two pieces of drywall or sheetrock come together. And so they have corner beading and they have corner flashing, and sometimes it's metal and sometimes it's plastic. Like old school, you just skip both of those and you just use paper, and you actually just put paper up there with your mud and then you mud around it. And the problem with the paper is if I bump into that, it's going to crack very easily. So they usually tend to put something like a metal corner around these things. So if you're within about a half to 3/4 of an inch of the edge, you're going to hit that metal flashing that Kenny was mentioning. So you try to keep a little bit of distance, but not so much that you miss the studs. So there's this, and a stud is usually 1.5 inches wide. So the other thing about this, on occasion they will put two studs side by side whenever it comes to a window or something that's this big. Oftentimes when it's a window in a house, whenever the window stops and goes down, you'll have an extra stud that's inside, not on the outside. So that's just sort of another little tip for you whenever you're looking for areas to anchor things.
Yeah, and real quick, Ryder, so if the corner piece, so just to be clear, when you're talking about the corner, we've got these two pieces of drywall. To make that hard corner they're talking about, they would put a little metal, basically, frame on that corner there, or sometimes plastic, or it used to be paper.
Yeah, it's kind of an L channel.
Like a little L-shaped thing, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so my question for you is, if that's made out of metal, and I live in an apartment building where the studs may be metal, any way how I would know, like, oh, I'm hitting what was the ankle thing called?
Oh, corner bead.
I'm hitting corner bead versus hitting the stud. Any idea?
Yeah, you can actually watch the sheetrock move a little bit. When you hit the flashing, then it's also a slightly different kind of metal. You can go through it quite easily with a drill gun, so that's not the issue. It's not going through it. It's really just trying to you don't want to mess up the integrity of the plaster that makes that nice clean corner. Because when you start pushing on the flashing, you can actually sort of watch the sheetrock around it start moving. And that's when you go, oh, all this sheetrock is stuck to that little corner bead, and it starts flexing with it whenever you hit it.
And that's where, like, if you went through it, like, yeah, maybe it'd hold up fine and it'd hold up your curtain, but maybe that would lead to cracking or some of your drywall coming off or things like that, which, one, is not necessarily pretty, and two, if you're in an apartment or something like that, then you're going to have to probably pay something for that damage.
Yeah, which is so strange because also plaster is super easy to fix and repair. I mean, once you've messed up the integrity of it, it won't hold anything anymore. But you just put a little more plaster on the top of it, cover it up with some paint, and most people will never know.
Yes, and so that will be one of the future things we do because one of our friends here has a couple holes in his wall. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take Ryder over there and say, hey, let's patch these holes, because I know it's something that is really easy to be intimidated by because it seems like a big thing. Like, oh, there's a big hole, what do I do? But it's honestly relatively simple and not too hard. And of course, when you have some studs like us here helping you out, it makes it that much easier. Yeah. Okay, so the curtain rod. So we've marked off now on the left side, the middle, and the right side where we think we're going to go. And we've level checked it, and then we kind of tweaked and said, oh, we need to go a little bit higher. When you said you wanted to go a little bit higher here, did you end up making another mark, or you just have that as a mental note?
That's a mental note right now. One of the things that I did was my initial marks were at 95, and that is the curtain length. So right now the curtain length would just barely touch the bottom of the floor. What I'm interested in is there are usually loops that go around the curtain rod that actually attach to it, and those will provide me with like an additional maybe ½ inch of space. So my first thought is to move that mark up a ½ inch just to keep the curtain from dragging on the floor. Even though if it touches the floor, that's okay because that helps also block out heat and cold and light as well. So that's the other fun thing about curtains. They're also a form of insulation because you're creating an air gap between the window and the curtain, and that's the same thing that happens between a wall. Is we talk about insulation in there, but an air gap is really one of the major reasons that you have any kind of insulation.
And the questioning that writer was having there about, well, how far will it actually go? Because another factor is, okay, they said this is 95 inches, but how close is it actually to 95 inches? And then you have these loops on this case here, and so like, okay, is that 95 inches to the middle of this hole? Is it to the top? You don't necessarily know exactly for sure, and that's the reason why we actually delayed for so long hanging this curtain rod, is because we didn't have this in our hands. And so now, at least for me, what I like to do is have the thing in my hand, so I know I don't, kind of like Ryder was saying with the thing, it's supposed to be level, it's supposed to be close, but the reality is it's not. And so it's nice to have the thing you have itself, so you can kind of see, all right, this is where it's going to hang, this is how much it's going to look go on the floor. And it's one thing to say, oh, it's going to be 1/4 inch on the floor. It's another thing to say, to see what it looks like, right? So that's one thing that I like to do.
And something that will probably happen is we're just going to go ahead and measure this right now, because no matter what we do, even with our best intentions, we will probably be off by a little bit. And that's because we don't do this all day, every day. That's the fun thing about DIY is you can get a lot of things done pretty good, but a professional really can do it a little bit better sometimes.
Just because they've done it so much, right?
Yes. So what I'm bumping into right now is that it's telling me that the curtain itself is about 93 inches. And it is 92 inches to the top of the ring. So while the curtain claims to be 95 inches long, it isn't. So this is a good thing to know, because if we hung this expecting 95, we would have a 3-inch float at the bottom. So one of the other things is, though, that this entire casement right here is about 94 to this point. So right now the curtain won't cover the entire space. So we've got a decision to make. We can either put up a curtain rod and just deal with that additional space, and we probably want that additional space to be at the bottom rather than the top. So that's my first thought, but I have to turn it over to the homeowner. Like, hey, buddy, what do you think?
Yeah, and this is the case where you realize first you bought a curtain and realized it wasn't long enough, because the standard size for something like this is something like 86 maybe, or something around those lines. And this is actually already this is a big window. This is a very big window. This is not a standard type of thing. And so we had to buy a longer version, which was supposedly 95 inches. And so now here we are doing this video, and of course now we see, oh, it's not actually even 95 inches. So the short answer is, I don't really know. But now I've been without a curtain for 3 weeks, so I would rather have a curtain rather than no curtain. And since we just had somebody agree live on camera that he knows how to patch holes, I'm going to say let's go ahead and do it, because if we need to lower it later on, we can. Yeah. And guess what's going to happen? Probably we'll just be like, good enough. Right. Good enough. Right. And that actually, when Danielle and I were doing our RV trip, we ended up naming our RV Good Enough, because that's what you got to do when you're doing home improvement projects, when you're launching businesses, when you're having shows, when you're inviting co-hosts. You just got to find someone who's good enough. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to hang up this curtain rod, because we know that the vast majority of people are going to be perfectly fine with good enough. And there's only people, like a small percentage of people like myself, who notice these tiny things like, oh, that person's curtain is only 1.5 inches off the ground versus, oh, that one's dragging. Oh, it's slightly angled. People aren't looking that closely at your stuff, y'all. Just don't worry about it. All right, so let's get hung.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, I'm going to get into the middle where you are, because one of the issues is if we have to have 3 of these, while over here on the sides, I could lower infinitely, right? It could just be like here, and we could have a super low curtain rod. There's nowhere to hang this one in the middle. And because this is an expanding curtain rod, then it's going to sag in the middle if we don't have support for it. So what will determine everything that we do is the center one, which is the opposite of what everyone tends to think. So the center piece is going to be the one that we use to line this up. And that will give us the height for the rest of them. And now that we know we're limited on what we can do as far as height due to the length of the curtain, we're just going to put this one up here. So I take the bracket itself and I just mount it here. There's two ways to do this. The easiest one for me right now is just going to be to mark it. And I just put a mark I have a drill here with a very tiny little drill bit. So I'm going to put that here. So that's nothing. I just went straight in, so that's only drywall right there. So we're going to need to have a plastic anchor there. For the plastic anchor, we're going to get a slightly bigger drill bit.
And one fun fact about the plastic anchors that I realized, if you ever buy a box of plastic anchors, you know, I sat there so many times with my drill bit and I'd like drill a hole, and the idea with the anchor hole is you want it to be just big enough where the anchor can barely fit in there. And you might not have heard because Ryder's using his drill right in front of the microphone. But what I was saying was, when you have these little drywall anchors, you want a drill that's just barely big enough for this to fit in there. And that's why sometimes people use a hammer so that it basically fits in there nice and snug. And at first I was just guessing. I was like holding it up next to the drill bit and I was like, I don't know, which one do I do? And then I realized, I looked on the box, it tells you, hey, use a 3/8 drill bit or whatever it is. So yeah, you can just look at the box if you're buying a box of them, or if it comes with instructions, you can also look on there. But of course, if you're as good looking and dashing as this stud over here, you just know, because you've touched enough studs and you've touched enough anchors in your day that you know how it's going down.
Well, the other little thing that I do is I align the drill bit with the thinnest part of the plug. So you still want the threads sticking out on the edges, and you would just use the drill bit. I'm sorry, this is kind of blocked out, but you would just use the drill bit as the inner part, allowing the threads to extend beyond it. So there's going to be multiple drill bit sizes. Just get the one that's closest. Always go smallest first.
Yes, always go smaller first.
Because it's hard to replace that drywall after you've drilled it out. So once I got in about an inch, I actually hit something that's in there. It's a good sign, but we're still going to try to use the plug. Do you have a hammer?
Monkey wrench.
Monkey wrench. Scalpel. And a lot of small, slight little baby taps on that whale on this. It's just going to break. It'll turn sideways. It won't go into the hole. So take it easy when you're using these plastic anchors. And let me grab this and this. I, for some reason, only have one charged battery today. Big no-no for a handyman. Always have multiple batteries. So now that the plug is in, here's my bracket. This is built with so on, down. I'm going to go ahead and tighten this up.
What's that fancy light thing coming out your drill?
Oh yeah. Yeah, because you're often working in dark spaces. If you're actually on a construction site, oftentimes the electricity is not set up yet where you're working, or you're working under a sink or something like that, very helpful to have a small light on your drill. And now that LEDs are so cheap, I don't even know if you can get one without a light on it.
Yeah, real quick to highlight one other option for lighting is using something like this, which is a headlamp. They're only a couple of dollars, but they're really nice to have, and that's been one of my favorite things because especially if you're working alone, you don't have somebody holding your light for you, it's hard for you to see. And so what you can do is you buy one of these little headlamps, and that way you always have light with you.
So re-leveling based off of this, because we know that the heights are different now. And can you hand me another bracket? And thank you.
So I know the average person at home probably is not going to have two sets of drills, but what are you switching between drills for?
Oh yes, sorry, this is actually a drill. So this is built primarily for drilling holes in things. This is called an impact driver, and this has a clutch in it and torsion, so you would need to use, they have specialized bits for these, but whenever the screw gets too far in, the clutch slips so that you don't overdrive, but it can also start kind of hammering on the drill, on the screw itself, and push it in. So if you wanted to go halfway through a 2x4, you just go, and this will just keep pushing in if you want it to, but also it starts warning you that the tension is high by letting the clutch slip a little bit. So that's that kind of ratcheting sound you will hear whenever I start drilling on this.
Yeah, and I was just going to grab what my drill looks like, because this is probably an average type of drill that a homeowner would get. And a lot of times they'll have this little ring that you turn at the top, and it's got numbers, which I believe correspond to maybe pounds of force. I'm not really sure. But
it's just, yeah, it's like turn it up to 11.
Yeah, so but basically when you have these numbers, so 4 here is pretty low. Well, when I spin this, if this is screwing into something that's like getting held, you can hear that sound. And that is basically saying, hey, you're at that much tension, you're at that much force. So when you're actually drilling something...
It's also a speed issue. When you're rotating that, it goes faster. So the lower is lower force and lower speed. And then when you crank it all the way up, you're at drill speed.
Okay, so I guess I wasn't sure. This is speed as well, or just the thing? Because I also have on mine up here a 1 and a 2 that can change the speed as well.
Yeah, so this is built into most of these, so it's a first and second gear. You know,
kind of like cars, it sounds like.
Yeah,
clutches, gears,
speeds. Yeah, they have made these fairly advanced. I almost never take my drill gun off of 2, and I almost never have it cranked below drill speed. Sometimes I do just when I'm trying to be delicate. Because for me, that's the kind of primary thing, is getting to know your tool. But once you've used it enough, you get good enough with your own touch. So this is embodied knowledge at that point.
Right. And so for those of you who are saying, well, what's drill speed? When you turn, as Ryder joked, up to 11, for mine it gets to like 23, and then there's one that literally just looks like a drill bit. And so that is the highest speed it will do. And also with mine, I believe, there is no clutch at that highest speed. Is that a thing?
I don't know. Mine still catches and will stall out if you get it caught or you do something like that. Now there are different kinds of tools. Festool. I'm actually wearing a Festool shirt today.
Hashtag not sponsored.
Not sponsored, but would love to be.
Yeah. Send us an email.
Oh my gosh. Call us. Total geek boy. Yeah. No, I love Festool, and they have a drill right now that actually has an anti-kickback device. I don't know if you've ever been using a drill, and if they're powerful enough, these little clutches that are built into them now is because previously you'd go into something and you'd go, and your wrist would get tweaked, and it could literally sprain your wrist. These tools got so strong. So I have like an old Milwaukee drill that it feels like if it gets stuck on something, it feels like your wrist gets broken whenever it spins around. So these clutches are great, but Festool has actually invented an anti-kickback, where it doesn't kick back over a quarter of a turn if it gets stuck. So that's really great if you're using something like heavy construction, hammer drill, you're going through metal, something like that where your bit is going to get caught.
Yeah, but if, for those of you at home are like, man, this is a lot of information about hardware and all these things. Well, that's one of the things that we like to do is we want to make sure to explain all of these things, because guess what? It's these little nuggets in between that pretty much everyone else leaves out. And so when you go and you watch that 5-minute video on how to hang a curtain, that's going to give you the basic steps. But it's not going to tell you about all these little things about, the metal in the corner, the spacing, sometimes it's double stud, sometimes below the windows. Those are the types of things that we like to include in our instructionals, because guess what? As people who have done the things, we've run into these issues and we've seen the problems that can come up. And also, we want to hear from you guys. So, we're talking about a lot here around hanging a curtain, but also some general things about hanging things in your house. So let us know any questions you have. Let us know any problems you have. And also feel free to send in a picture or a video, and we will answer your questions. So you can do that by going to our website, helpfulforlife.com, and hitting the Contact Us button in the top right. And you can also leave a comment down below. So let us know, and we will answer those questions for you. So we're here hanging the curtain. We've now successfully put one in the middle. As Ryder pointed out, the middle is actually where you want to start, not on the sides, contrary to what you might think. And then now that he's used his level again to confirm how high up that hole should go. And now he's drilling into the wall. He's trying to see the resistance to see, is this a stud or is this just drywall? So he knows whether or not he needs to use a drywall anchor. What'd you find out?
There is something back there, and I think it's a stud. I went in about a 1/2 inch and I met some resistance, and it went through pretty easily. I did not see sawdust come out, so I'm not 100% sure. So what I'm going to do is just, because the screw is smaller than the plug, I'm going to go ahead and just put the screw in and see what it hits, and then I can just back the screw out.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't do this very often, you're like, how can you tell by feel like what's going on? But and this is, especially if you have like a laundry room or somewhere where you're not as worried about appearances, maybe your garage or something like that, don't be afraid to just take a couple screws to the wall in your garage or whatnot and find those studs, and you can tell the feeling how different it is when you're screwing into just drywall versus when you're screwing into something like a stud. And it starts to move a little easier in drywall, and once you screw it in, you find out it's not like no resistance there, and sometimes it'll actually just keep spinning infinitely.
Yeah, and that's something else that happens as well with just using screws. When you go into something like drywall, if you go all the way in, it'll start spinning. You lose any grip you ever had in that drywall. It's the same with wood, and with wood, typically your screw will keep going through the wood because it has enough grip, but with something like drywall, it just spins, and that strips everything out that would ever hold the screw in place. So it's good to be sort of gentle with these things. When we're talking about some of this, you can actually feel your drill bit go it's like it's going through butter, and all of a sudden it hits something slightly harder, and you go, oh, resistance. And
Ice.
Yeah, I don't know what
Frozen butter.
Frozen butter.
Yes.
Frozen butter. That's such a good analogy. That should be it. Yeah.
But yeah, so as we're doing this, and as you're drilling a hole for your drywall anchor, one thing I know that's happened to me that's been kind of troublesome is, oh no, I made the hole too big. And this is exactly where it needs to be. And I've already measured this and leveled it to be exactly this spot. So what do you do in that case whenever you've made the hole and it's been too big?
Well, there's a couple things. One, you can just redo the whole process, move everything a 1/2 inch one direction or the other, up, down, sideways. But if that is the spot you need it to be, and you've just somehow wallowed out that sheetrock, then you can either repair that, you can cut out an area around it, repair that entire piece of sheetrock, which is more effort than almost anyone probably wants to go to.
Even the pros.
Even the pros, right? There are things like getting a bigger plug, putting a bigger plug in there, using a bigger screw that would go in, things like that. Now, if it has to be the same size hole, same size plug, all those kind of things, you're really kind of out of luck unless you can find some way to put something in there that would be like, I've seen people do it with wood before, where you put in something like a dowel rod into that hole. And if
essentially give it something else to grip onto. Right?
Yes, and you would have some alternate form of support that you put in there. So the idea would be some sort of plastic tube or something that you could put in there that would actually shrink the diameter of that hole, and then you can probably get your screw in. I'm not going to sort of validate any of those.
I will say that as the average person at home doing this type of thing, for me, I'm relatively handy. I can figure out a lot of things, but for that case, I actually was hanging some shelves in my laundry room, and I had that happen. I made the hole too big. I think I used the right size bit, but I moved my hand around a little bit too much as I was drilling the hole, and therefore it made the hole too big. And I was like, oh darn, what am I going to do? And in my case, I just grabbed a bigger anchor, and then I put that in. And so that's the first thing that I did. And if it had gone past that point, that's when I would have phoned a friend. I would have called somebody I know that is a little bit handy, or I would have gone up to the hardware store and asked for advice. If you're going to do that, if you have an Ace Hardware near you, they pride themselves on having very good customer service. And I've had kind of hit or miss luck with Lowe's and Home Depot when I ask somebody. Sometimes they're extremely helpful, and they'll essentially design your whole project for you. And other times they're like, I just started here today, or oh, this is a summer job for me, man. Sorry, I don't know anything. So it's kind of a toss-up.
I've gotten to the point where I do treat Lowe's and Home Depot like a warehouse. Because half the time I have gotten incorrect advice from very well-intentioned people there, and that sets you back in your sort of journey. You know, when you're doing DIY project, just go ahead and plan in 2 or 3 trips to Home Depot or Lowe's. You think you're gonna get it all in one, it almost never works that way. If you're like me, you just start stockpiling stuff. So I just have extra buckets and things, and just, different kinds of screws. I always buy 100 of something rather than, if it's something like screws or fittings or connections, because who knows? I'm going to keep probably finding uses for them in the future. And oftentimes the price break makes more sense that way anyhow.
Right, and when you're buying things, especially when it comes to screws or drywall anchors or whatever, it's not a bad idea to buy that one and then the size up, or the size down. And again, just like we talked about yesterday when we were talking about purchasing decisions, remember, you can always return the thing. And so that's the thing that I learned in the RV. It's like, all right, I need to buy this size tubing for some plumbing I'm doing. I'm buying a size bigger, a size smaller. And I'm just going to go return the ones I don't use. And I think I need this fitting, but it might also be that fitting. I'm buying all 5 fittings, and then I'll return them. And in some cases, I won't return them because it's like $1, a couple of dollars, or a few cents in some of this hardware case. It's like, then it's better just have it on hand, because guess what's more annoying? When you plopped open your beer, you're sitting here hanging the curtain rod, and you're like, I need a bigger drywall anchor. And then you just go to your miscellaneous toolbox, or you grab those leftover ones from the previous project. It makes it that much more satisfying.
It does, and at the end of the day, this is not a hard task to do, and I think literally I could have probably done the whole thing in 10 minutes if I was focused. And that also only happens if you have all the right tools. So if you don't have the correct tools at the correct time, I just hate to say it, but you're never going to actually get the work done. So it's just because then you have to outsource it to somebody else like me. It takes weeks.
Right. And that's one of the nice things about watching some sort of instructional like this, is we're here to give you all of the things that could happen, all the things you should plan for, and that way you get what you need in advance. And the classic example I think of is assembling IKEA furniture. And then you get to step 15 and you're like, I'm not really sure what to do here, or this is slightly off. Well, that's where it's like, all right, here's all of the things, which sounds like overkill probably to a lot of you, but then you run into one of those things and you're like, yes, helpful for life. They told me I need to worry about that metal thing around the corner, so I'm going to avoid that.
Yeah. So I was just measuring up here. This one that I just hung is about 1 inch away from the side on a vertical. It's about 1 inch away from the frame, just to make sure that I still hit whatever sort of 2x4 or stud, whatever load-bearing support is there. But I also want to make sure that I'm not hitting that sort of flashing or corner beating.
So he's moved far enough away from the corner, which is, I don't know, a half inch, quarter inch, something like that, to avoid that corner flashing, and then, but not so far to where you miss the stud. And you said the width of the stud is on average
inch and a half.
An inch and a half.
So yeah, I moved this one out an inch, and the corner flashing or beading is probably between a half and 3/4 of an inch. So that's just kind of a rough framework you can use.
And one thing I want to point out with, if you have a stud, say this is an inch and a half wide, if you're catching just the side of it or you're too far to the edge, it's not going to be a very good, not going to be very secure. So you don't want to go too far to the side. So if you went a whole inch and a half to the side, you would just get the edge of it and it wouldn't really do what you want to do. One thing I wanted to point out that this curtain rod, it came with a paper guide. And so it has inching marks here. And so you can actually put this up on your wall to see. And so say, from the corner of your window, you want it to be 1 inch to the left and 2 inches up. You could use a paper like this, put it up, hold it up, maybe put a level on it to make sure that you're getting it level on both sides. And then you could use a paper guide like that to make it a little easier.
So once again, leveling off of this one, where the lower bracket is. You could go on top, but I'm doing it where this point hits. You could do it anywhere. You just need to choose a consistent spot to level from each side. And if there was a stud on that side, I'm pretty sure there's going to be one on this side. And now I won't need to deal with these plugs. All I'm going to need is the bracket itself and a screw. If this place is built the same way I would think it would be built. Remember once again that I'm an inch off, so I'm just going to mark that out so that this is symmetrical.
So let's talk real quick about the markings that you've made over there. So you have one little tiny mark where you drew 1 inch from the side, and then you have one mark above that where you just used the level and you drew a little line to show where that is level. And then I'm guessing you're going to find the intersection of those two?
I already have. One of those marks is the intersection.
Okay.
So these are not very good marks to show to an audience.
Sure.
But I've been doing this long enough that I kind of have an inkling of what marks I'm using and which ones I want to use.
You can decipher your own handwriting.
Yes. But normally what you would do is use long verticals, long horizontals to make sure you knew which axis you're actually measuring for and accounting for. The other thing that you can do when it comes to areas where you're going to drill is put an X. And that way the center X marks the spot, that's where you drill, that's the correspondence. And of course it can look more like an ambulance sign or a cross, right? So that you can bisect that horizontal and vertical. But since this is a bracket, I put where the bracket goes up on the top, and I aligned that with the inch offset, and then just put a dot where I know that the screw needs to go.
So did you actually held up the thing and you used your pencil and you poked through the middle?
Yep, because at the end of the day, measuring is great, but more problems occur when you're measuring things than when you're just handling the actual objects.
Right.
So if you can ever get away without measuring something and only use actual objects and mark it out with a pencil, do that every time. Tape measures are great, but I've also encountered so many mistakes where something was 74.5, but I measured out as 73.5, and then I cut off too much lumber. I lost the entire piece of wood because then it's too short. So there's little things like that. And if I just took the stick of wood and I went up to the wall, put it against the wall, marked it with a pencil in 2 spots, I would know exactly where to cut it.
Yeah. And so when you're marking things like this to hang on the wall, you literally pretend your pencil is the screw, and you mark a little dot where the screw would go. And so in the case of this little mount thing, real quick, just want to point out that there's the fatter part so that the screw can fit through, because the screw's got a big head, and so it goes into there and then it slides up. So you want to mark in that little top notch right there. So that's where the hole should be, not down at the bottom.
Correct, and thanks for bringing that up, because that would put you off about a 1/2 inch on your height if you went for the sort of larger area where the head comes through. And this just comes from practice, from doing this several times. This looks kind of weird, but playing around with the toys before you put it up on the wall is a really good idea. Just figuring out where these things fit and where they go.
Yeah, and Ryder, for our non-US viewers, real quick, will you convert all of the measurements we've done today into metric?
12.
Perfect.
No, wait, 10. Everything's best
Everything's
10.
tens.
Yeah. I'm still imperial, but I'm gradually getting into using metric a little bit more. And that's just because a lot of the tools that I like using are coming from places like Germany. And so they have a different system there. And there's something really nice about everything being divisible by certain amounts. And sometimes I think that our sort of halves and quarters and eighths scale
makes things a little more complicated.
Yeah.
I just heard a fun story in marketing campaign that one of the fast food chains, I think it's A&W's, which if you've heard of A&W, they do root beer, but they also have a little fast food chain where they sell burgers and fries and things like that. And they had a 3rd-pound burger that they were selling, and they advertised it, and people thought, like, I don't know, 50% of Americans or whatever, I don't remember the actual stat,
they thought it was more?
It was smaller. They thought it was smaller than a 1/4-pound burger.
Oh.
Because 1/4, the number 4 on the bottom is bigger. So they thought that. And so now they actually had this genius marketing campaign where they said, if we're out of our 3rd-pound burgers, 1/3, you can get a 2/6 burger, 2/6. And if we're out of that, we will actually give you a 3/9 burger, a 3/9 burger, which are all the same number, just different fractions, for those of you who have not done fractions since elementary school.
You know, that's funny, but it is kind of true that most of us always complained in school that we didn't know when we were ever going to use math. And as far as things like calculus, I have very seldom had to use that. But when it comes to things like fractions and just basic measurements, yeah, those are good things to know.
They're good things to know.
Yeah.
All right, so now we officially have the middle, the left, and the right. So in this case, the curtain rod, since it's going over such a wide window, it has 3 mounts or anchors, or what would you call those things?
Yeah, mounts is good. And also, each one of these has a screw that's up here that is a tension screw. So each one of these brackets has an individual screw that's a hook system. And I'm going to unscrew that a little bit, but once we put the rod in, you can actually tighten this little knob back up, and it helps lock the rod into place so that the rod doesn't slip side to side. So, Sir Kinney of the Tall.
Does this metal tension need to be loosened?
Yeah, so we need, you notice that this is bowing a little at the top. This one is fitting just fine, and the one Regis left also needs to be detensioned a little bit more just to get that rod to drop all the way in.
So you can just unscrew that with your fingers. And you can see I'm so short, I have to be on my tippy toes, even on top of this stool. So in some cases you might want to get a ladder or a bigger step stool.
Yeah, and then just tighten this back up, and it helps lock this into place. That's it. We have just installed the curtain rod, but of course without the actual curtain yet. Just wanted to test that out first, you know, before we go through all that extra trouble.
Yep, and then real quick I just wanted to show what that holding screw looked like. So you have the little hook, or the mount, if you will, there. And then you have the curtain rod there, which can slide back and forth and rotate and things like that. So you have this little screw, which is orange, that I've drawn here, and you screw that in enough, which you can just do with your hand. You don't need to use a screwdriver or anything like that, to push up against that rod to prevent it from sliding left and right or rotating too much and things like that. That way it holds in place. So one last thing I wanted to point out with the curtain rod is, one thing you might want to pay attention to is how far over the end is. So right here, you say we've got like an inch or so on this side. You kind of want to make it parallel, or whatever that word is, symmetrical. So you don't have 5 inches on one side and 2 inches on the other. you want to kind of have it centered with roughly the same amount here and roughly the same amount there.
The other thing you're going to want to do is when you putting your curtain on, you're going to probably want one loop on the outside, and that prevents, when you pull the curtains this way, it prevents it from pulling all the way across. Then it just depends on your preferences, but these can act as stops for the curtain, and that's the same thing this one will probably do in the middle, is act as a stop whenever you're pulling them together.
Well, Ryder, let's see how your work did. You hold up the level at the end to see how level you get it?
Oh, let's give that a shot. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. So, I'm going to put it on top of those two. Hey, level.
Hey, that looks pretty darn level. Hold
well
up one more time.
Oh, sorry. We're well within tolerance, folks.
Look at that. You can see, in case you haven't used the level before, you want the bubble to be between the two lines in the middle. Which is exactly what he's done here, so let's give him a round of applause.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Any other last thoughts on curtains or hanging curtain rods?
No, none.
All
I think we
good.
talked it out.
We've exhausted that one pretty good. So for those of you like, well, the curtain's not up yet. Well, the last step would be the little balls on the end. One of those you unscrew, and then you basically take the curtain itself and you just slide those rings on. And in this case, and in most cases, you will need to have multiple curtain panels. You'll have one on the left side, one on the right side. In this case here, we may even have to have 3. I can't remember just how wide those are. So that would be some of the planning you do before. You see, okay, how wide is my window? How wide are these panels? How many do I need? And do I want them to just be decorative and just kind of be on the side? Or do I want them to be functional and actually block light? And in that case, you want it to be able to cover the entire gap. So you say, oh, this is 30 inches wide. It's a 90-inch gap. I'll need 3 of them, 3 times 30. So yeah, I think that is it. Probably the most in-depth video about hanging curtains that is out there on the internet. Who knows? We'll find out.
And we still haven't even hung the curtain.
And we still haven't even hung the curtain. So with that, this will wrap up the end of our morning show. So if you're watching this in this separate video that is just about curtains, we have a morning show that we do. It's called What the Hell is Water? And this is actually, I think, the first time we've said the name on air. But come check us out on YouTube. Helpful for Life is the channel name, which is also the company name. And also today marks the first day we've started broadcasting on multiple platforms. So right now we're also on Twitch, and we're working on getting on Facebook, and we're going to be on other platforms as well. So make sure to join us, and if you can also listen to us on the podcast, any podcast player of your whatever the word is. Choice. Yes, that's the one.
So many choices.
So with that, thank you guys for joining us. And what's our challenge for today?
Oh man, completely blanked. Let's go back to expectations.
Yeah, so what is something that you can change your expectations on? You know, with the holidays coming up, maybe that's what Thanksgiving is. What does that look like for your family, and how can you change the expectations of that will be?
Maybe don't have any this time. Like, don't expect amazing turkey.
Yeah, or, you know, you could expect, like, that one crazy uncle, that one crazy writer friend's going to come over, and they're going to ruin everything. And then when they don't ruin everything, it's a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, when he doesn't show up, you're going to be so happy.
Yes. But with that, everyone have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend.